Good evening. How's everybody tonight? A little warm again in here. It's always summer in edible education. Looks like a couple of you are watching the debates. For those of you who are going to miss them, they will be rerun, I think, in their entirety starting at 10 o'clock. So you'll get a chance. And hopefully no one will tell you what happened. Can you hear me okay? In the back? Yes? Okay, great. Couple announcements before I introduce our guests. The discussion section tomorrow is going to be very interesting. Haven Bork and Lena Brook, who worked with the Meatless Monday campaign, which you'll hear a little bit about, I'm sure, from Bob Martin, and have a lot of experience working on communications around food policy, will be at the discussion section. So that's tomorrow at Barrows Hall 166. I hope many of you can make it. Claire Kremen's Google Hangout will be Monday the 22nd at 10:30 a.m. The questions are already in, but we welcome viewers. Bob Martin's Google Hangout will be Wednesday the 7th of November at 1:30 p.m. Question submissions still welcome. And Mike Callicrate's Hangout will be Wednesday the 14th of November at 3 p.m. And we'll be calling for questions next week. Something to mark on your calendars. You may have seen it on the syllabus, but we have a kind of special opportunity when Wendell Berry comes to campus on Wednesday, October 31st. He's going to be speaking, and there's going to be a panel discussion about him and his work that I'm going to be on, Bob Haas is going to be on, and Miguel Altieri, and someone else from literature whose name I don't have. But it's at 4 o'clock in this space on Wednesday, okay? It's not a normal class time. It's strictly optional, but you will, it's just a kind of rare opportunity. Wendell Berry doesn't travel that much or speak that much these days, and he's just absolutely fantastic. And he really is one of the founders of this movement we've been talking about for these 8 weeks. Quick question? Wednesday the 31st at 4 p.m. Now, there are no reserved seats, so get here at 3. They'll start handing out tickets at 3, okay? Anyway, I highly recommend it. Okay, attendance question. Get out your clickers. How many of you are vegans? That's A. Vegetarians, B. Omnivores, C. Okay? A, vegan. B, vegetarian. C, omnivore. We should probably do this again at the end of the class because it might change a little bit today. We'll have to see. But today we're going to talk about animal agriculture and its place in our food chain. And probably animal agriculture is the most troubled and troubling part of that whole system. We're going to look at the politics and the economics of meat production, as well as the environmental and ethical implications of the system. We're really fortunate to have two of the most knowledgeable people on these issues have come to talk to us, who know more about how the system works and fails to work than just about anyone in the country. I've interviewed them both over the years and always come away educated. And enlightened. And what we're going to do is they're each going to present for somewhere close to 30 minutes, and then we're going to sit down and for a conversation and to take your questions. I'll introduce them both right now, but going first will be Mike Callicrate. Mike is right in the thick of the meat industry. He's a cattle producer. He's got a ranch in St. Francis, Kansas, but he commutes to Colorado Springs where he has a meat business. And not only is he a cattle producer, he's a major thorn in the side of what Upton Sinclair called the beef trust, the oligopoly of companies that control beef production. And the reason he markets his own beef, I believe, is because they stopped buying from him. They didn't want to have anything to do with him. He was so much trouble. This experience has made him a really trenchant critic of antitrust and monopoly in the meat industry, an issue he's pursued through his work with the Organization of Competitive Markets and a couple of class action suits he's launched. He set up his own company, Ranch Direct, to distribute and market his beef in Colorado. Bob Martin comes at the issue from more of a Washington, D.C. policy perspective. He worked for a couple of senators and a congressman on the Hill, but he knows the meat industry inside out from his work chairing the Pew Commission on animal agriculture, which is probably the most comprehensive study ever done. Bob got together all the different stakeholders, a remarkable range of people, to analyze this, and they were all represented on the commission, and even with that, it was a devastating report, even so. To quote from his introduction, which some of you may have read, it was on BSpace, "The present system of producing food animals in the United States is not sustainable and presents an unacceptable level of risk to public health and damage to the environment, as well as unnecessary harm to the animals we raise for food." He did that while working for the Pew Charitable Trusts. Now he works as a senior policy advisor for Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, where he's also a senior lecturer at Johns Hopkins at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. So we've got the best possible people we could have here to learn about meat. And let me introduce Mike to start things. Mike Callicrate.
Thank you, Michael. What an honor to be here among this group and to be with Michael Pollan, one of the people I look up most to of the many people that are fighting this battle to restore fairness and health really back to our food system. I want to talk about my experience in the cattle business. I came from Evergreen, Colorado, grew up on a little 5-acre place there. My father grew up on a farm. His father was a tenant farmer, in a dryland tenant farmer in Weld County, Colorado. They get 12 inches of rain there a year, if that. So, you know, grew up in a tough way. But I learned everything you can learn about livestock and growing stuff on 5 acres, and then after I graduated from college, I ended up going back to St. Francis, Kansas, where I farm and ranch. So this is where you grew up. What happened, Grandpa? It was my 10th year class reunion, the summer of 1979. We were at Tina Owens' place on Upper Bear Creek, just west of Evergreen, having a class picnic. And Mrs. Owens asked me, "Mike, what do you do?" And I said, "I farm and ranch." And she says, "Oh, wow, you're a wealth creator." And I thought, cool. She said, "Yeah." She said, "My dad, my grandfather told me when I was a little girl that farmers and ranchers create wealth and that everybody else does the laundry." You know, and Ben Franklin, our founding father, Ben Franklin, thought a lot of farmers. In fact, he said there are 3 ways, essentially, to acquire wealth. Number 1, you can conquer it like the Romans did. He said that's called robbery. He says, number 2, you can make it through commerce, which is basically cheating. And that's what corporations do. What corporation was he talking about? Do you remember back in 1776, the fuss we were having with the East India Company and its relationship to the Crown, and how the East India Company and the Crown had partnered in colonizing as much of the world as they possibly could. And we were their colony at that time. So it stands to reason that Ben Franklin didn't think a lot of corporations at that time, because the biggest one in the world was the East India Company. What is the comparable one today? It's Cargill. Cargill, the biggest privately held corporation on the planet Earth. Koch Industries would be the second. Both fine, upstanding companies, right? And so it was interesting because Ben Franklin said, but he said there's a 3rd way to acquire wealth, and he said it's by farming. He said it's a miracle. You can put a seed in the soil and you can add water and sunshine, and as if by a miracle, wealth is created, and it's created every year. So these farmers are pretty darn important people, and this young man asked his grandfather, what happened? The U.S. has lost over 40% of its ranchers, 90% of its hog farmers, 80% of its dairymen in the last 30 years. This is when we have been under hyper-industrialization of our food system. Massive corporate concentration and power in the hands of a few companies. An endangered species, the cowboy, every month 1,000 ranchers go out of production. For the last 30 years, every month 1,000 ranchers have gone out of production. This is the national security issue no one is talking about. How are we going to feed ourselves? How are we going to get the wealth from the land without people on the land and people in a rural community receiving a fair income? And this is what happened. In 1975, we had about we had a lot of meat packers. I had 20 that would come to my place in St. Francis, Kansas. They even slept in their car outside on a Sunday night so they could be the first one on Monday morning to be able to buy the cattle that I had for sale. There was a lot of competition. They were all making money. The retailers were making money. The food service companies were making money. The industry was healthy. There was profitability, and there was competition. In 1975, the four-firm concentration was around 35%, 36%, which is plenty high, actually. But by 1995, we had four-firm concentration at over 80 to 85%. Biggest meat packer in the world was IBP, and you can see they started fixing the price until Mad Cow hit, and then they really hammered the rancher. They really hammered that cattle producer because of the Mad Cow scare in Canada. They lowered the prices here just because they could. The price at the retail did not go down. And then we filed lawsuits. We did all kinds of things and raised a bunch of heck. And we finally got this price back up to just a slightly over 50%. So the rancher is getting a better price today than he has in the past, but it still is not one that a competitive market would deliver. Barry Lynn, Cornered, the new monopoly capitalism and the economics of destruction. This is the most important book that I have read in the last while. And instead of those presidential candidates arguing with each other tonight, they need to be reading this book. Because if you want to fix the economy, you address the monopoly power in our economy so that we get fair distribution of wealth and we get prosperity back again from the people who make things and the people who grow things. Did you see the 60 Minutes piece a couple of weeks ago about Luxottica? How many of you wear sunglasses? All of you. How many choices do you have? A whole bunch, but they're all owned by the same company. That was chapter 2 of Cornered. There is money in the food business. I fly back and forth from St. Francis, Kansas every week, essentially every week, to our meat company in Colorado Springs. And so here I am. It is, what is the date there? It's September 1st. In the fall, every year, the masters of the universe of food meet at the Broadmoor in Colorado Springs. I landed and I saw these airplanes, and I like airplanes, but I got a little airplane that I've owned for 26 years, and it has one engine, and it holds 4 people, and it doesn't cost much. And I land at the airport, and I honestly, never in my life have I seen this many expensive corporate jets. This is Walmart's jet right here. It's $58 million. It's made in Canada. And you can just look up the tail numbers on any of these, and it's Cargill, it's Smuckers, it's Wells Fargo Bank. It's the masters of the universe of the food industry. And I wondered what was going on. So I went into the FBO, which is called a fixed base operator, where we buy our gas, and I said, what's going on? They said, oh, there's a food meeting out at the Broadmoor. Aha, a food meeting. So I jump in my outfit, and I run over to the Broadmoor, and I drive up, and you can't get in the front door for all of the golf bags that are right here. And so I finally make my way in, and there, it's wide open. I go right into the meeting area where they're planning it all out, and the agenda's laid there. You can't believe this. Walmart was there giving the talk on sustainability. Wow. Wisdom. the deepest wisdom. And so I'm looking at this thing, and I just cannot believe that these people are all gathering in the same place. All the meat packers are there. Do you suppose they're talking about market share and price and a few things like that? So I go back to the airport, and I take a picture of these airplanes. And I look, if you go to Google, you can Google the VIN number on the tail of the airplane, and it'll tell you who owns it. Or it'll be a holding company or something, but you can pretty well figure out who owns these airplanes. And I used to show that slide, but I might get in too much trouble, by telling you all who owns these airplanes. So we don't want too many aggressive inspections as you fly across the country commercially. So anyway, just for your information. So they were having a big party at the Broadmoor, and it was an expensive party. And meanwhile, the next weekend I went back to St. Francis and I shot a few pictures. Meanwhile, back on the farm, here we are. I don't know when the last time somebody bought a new truck. I mean, the farm is getting no money out of this food system, not enough to sustain themselves. And so not only have we lost all these farmers, but in this community of St. Francis, Kansas, we've lost half our kids in the food system. In the school system, the school system. In the last 30 years, half the kids are gone. There's for sale signs up and down the streets. Real estate prices in town are low. That's all changed some as far as real estate prices. Farm prices have come up since the 2008 collapse of Wall Street because they're all looking up for a place to put their money. And we can talk more about that later if you want. But these farms have been abandoned, and we have run the people off these farms based on government policy of 50 years ago. We had a council on economic development that was put together of the business leaders of our country, and they decided that we need this labor that's on farms in factories. We need that excess human resource off of that farm in the city so we can get some cheaper labor. And these are good workers too, with a lot of work ethic, and they aren't late when they come to work. And these people were, by policy, moved from the farms with low prices on commodities, unfair markets, etc. And those documents are available for you to look at. America becoming a land without farmers. The plutocratic remaking of America has a parallel in the countryside. In rural America, less than 3% of farmers make more than 63% of the money. So there are farmers out there that are making a lot of money. But at what point do you need your neighbor more than you need his land? These farmers have been driven to take over their neighbors' farms. They celebrate when they get a bigger tractor. But who is subsidizing their operations? We are as taxpayers through these farm programs that are running people off the land and keeping us from feeding ourselves good food. The results of this emerging feudal economy are everywhere. Large areas of the United States are becoming impoverished farm towns with abandoned farmhouses and deserted land. More and more of the countryside has been devoted to massive factory farms and plantations. You should be suing Walmart instead of IBP. They are the problem. They tell us what they will pay, and we have no choice but to pay you less. This is what John Tyson told me in San Antonio, Texas in 2002 at the National Cattlemen's Beef Association meeting when I introduced myself to him on the trade show floor. And I knew in 10 minutes he had to be at a press conference, and he was announcing the fact that Tyson had bought IBP. IBP was a company that I had filed suit against in 1996 for anti-competitive practices based on the Packers and Stockyards Act. And I asked John Tyson, I said, do you know about the lawsuit? What lawsuit? He's fixing to buy the company. And this lawsuit is a big deal. It potentially could cost the company a lot of money. And he said, what lawsuit? And I explained, well, it's based on the Packers and Stockyards Act, which is supposed to keep markets fair from almost 100 years ago when we had the last beef trust, the last real monopoly in beef, as not as powerful, though, as we have today. And John Tyson said, I know all about the Packers and Stockyards Act. And I said, yes, I know you do. And you wouldn't be where you are today in the chicken business had it been enforced. And he got a little fussed over that. And so finally he said, Mike, you're suing the wrong people. You should sue Walmart, not me. They dictate price to me. I have no choice but to pay you less. And I said, hey, I would love to sue Walmart. I don't think there's a greater threat on the globe to our economic and social well-being than that company. But I can't. Illinois BRIC is a federal statute that has only been repealed, I think, in 11 states. And Illinois BRIC says, unless I am directly affected, I cannot sue. So, John, I have to sue you, and you sue Walmart. Well, fat chance of that. Walmart gave him the pork, the chicken, and the beef. Now what can he do on pricing? If he's got more chicken to sell, you raise the beef price. He controls this thing at that point. And remember now, he's cooperating with his competition. Well, this is what you get when you go up against these guys. Do any of you guys know what this is? This is a feedlot. Michael, we talked about feedlots. How many years ago when you did Power Steer? Feedlots are where cattle are fed and they are cared for. But there's big feedlots. 70 miles from me is the biggest one in the world. It's 130,000 head of cattle in one place. That's too many. That's way too many. This feedlot was designed to hold 12,000, and it was the second one that I'd built. But I got out of college in 1975 with an animal science degree. Now, don't confuse that with an animal husbandry degree. There's a big difference. They didn't teach animal husbandry when I went to Colorado State University. So, I get crossways with the Packers. I've got this fairly small feedlot of 12,000 head that I owned at the time. I was a partner in the other one, the first one I built. And I've been blackballed. I have been boycotted by the biggest packers. And I've got 832 head of cattle on the list to sell that week, and I have no bids for the third week in a row. Finally, my national beef buyer comes in that day, and I say, Don, what is going on? I can't sell my cattle. He said, Mike, I've been told not to buy your cattle because you're not speaking kindly of the packers. So I call up our friend Dan Glickman, my former congressman from Kansas, now Secretary of Agriculture. And I said, Dan, Mike Callicrate, I'd written him some really nasty letters. He knew who I was because he wasn't doing his job of enforcing the Packers and Stockyards Act. And so I said, hey, Dan, now why don't you enforce that Packers and Stockyards Act? You know, I got all these cattle I can't sell. The Packers are cooperating. They're not competing. You know, I'm being mistreated. And he said, well, you know, Mike, today we've got this global market, and you need big companies that can do business globally. Oh, that's great, Dan. What am I going to do? Well, he called up ConAgra and made him buy all my cattle. ConAgra. As those cattle became finished, they bought them all and they took them. And I shut down, and that's what it looks like when that happens. 15 people lose their job. The corn market isn't as good. The hay market's not as good. We're not able to buy from the wealth creators in our community. We're not able to employ the people in our community. The average return on equity before tax. Look, this is an indicator of whether the market is competitive or not. In the last 6 years, the retail grocery return on investment is 21%. The meat packing industry, which always complains that they're losing money, they always complain that they're in the red, have made 17%. That is phenomenal. That is a phenomenal return on your equity. Wall Street does not deliver that. All farming and ranching return on investment on equity has been a negative 0.5% for the last 13 years. And depending on what industry or what sector of the industry you were in, it could have been far worse than that. If you owned hogs in 1998, they were worth 8 cents. You lost it all. Milk prices. Look at milk prices today and look at what feed costs are. These guys are getting hammered. And it's all because of big food controlling these markets. This is industrial agriculture controlled by a handful of companies, from Monsanto to Tyson to Cargill to JBS, which is a foreign company from Brazil. Farmers and ranchers do not have access to the marketplace because of this bottleneck. Anybody that flies an airplane knows how dangerous a thunderstorm is. There is some really, really bad stuff in this thunderstorm. There's ice, there's hail, there is turbulence. I don't care how big the airplane is. I don't care if it's 747. The wings come off when you go into a thunderstorm. You do not go there if you are thinking about starting a food company. You do not want to sell to Whole Foods. You do not want to sell to Walmart. You want to figure out how to go as direct as you possibly can. Now let's just review for a second. And this is new, some of this is new information we can talk about later, but let's just talk about what a dark place this thunderstorm is of big food. It's a lawless place. We've talked about that. There's no rules. A place where money and power come before people and freedom, where kickbacks and predatory pricing are standard practice, where workers, animals, and the earth are abused and exploited, where where family farms and ranches are bankrupted by rigged markets. That's what's in this thunderstorm. It's a place where the farmer becomes an indentured servant, a serf, signing a short-term contract with a dishonest processor and a lifetime mortgage that he will likely never be able to pay. It's where pink slime is considered beef. Big food makes money making us sick and leaves us with the bill. Where growth-enhancing compounds are illegal in sports. Lance Armstrong? But legal in the meat that we eat. Where food is taken from the hungriest people in the poorest places on earth to sell to those with the most money. This is big food. They're global corporations, as Dan Glickman described. It's a place where the biggest cheaters win. Big food controls the government and our universities that our tax dollars support. Land-grant universities is supporting big agribusiness, industrial agriculture, not family farm and ranch agriculture. Today's big food, industrial food system is a full return to Upton Sinclair's jungle. That makes people cringe when I say that, and it most certainly is. Let me just share with you today's news headlines. This comes from the meeting place, which is where the news from the big meat packing and industrial food system comes. ConAgra to close Tennessee Pride plant. House of Rayford fined for child labor violation. This is the kosher plant. Uninspected and misbranded beef pork products recalled. Processing line speeds are too fast at XL, the union says. That's the Canadian plant that's recalling all this stuff. Just one Bubba Burger Grill still operating, report says. Do you remember reading Fast Food Nation? And do you remember Conway's Red Top that was talked about, that Eric talked about? They bought local beef, and they really had great hamburgers, and they were very, very popular, and they had 5 locations. They just closed about a month ago. First thing they did was quit using local beef, trying to compete on price and be the low-cost hamburger place, rather than tell people where that food came from and how good it was and perhaps grow their business. They went to this big food side. They started buying from U.S. foods. So we have to go around this big food. We have to go around this thunderstorm. This is where I live. This is where Ranch Foods Direct is in Colorado Springs. Taco Bell, Sonic, McDonald's, Arby's. This is a Burger King now. And I decided if I'm going to get in the meat business, because you saw my empty feedlot, if I'm going to get in the meat business, I'm not going to compete with the big packers. I'm not going to compete with the big food service companies. I'm going to produce the best beef that I can possibly produce. And so there went the hormones, there went the steroids, there went the subtherapeutic antibiotics, and here came the Angus cows and the Wagyu bulls. The Wagyu is where Kobe beef comes from. Healthy fat profile, omega-3s, CLA. We did everything you could possibly do to make this the best product in the world. And so we came up with this idea about, do you want real meat? That kind of sounds aggressive, but you know what? It was 3 days later that this billboard went up on Fillmore. And Taco Bell, conversation was, only 38% of their meat is meat. And so, of course, we went out and took a little picture of that, right? And we put it on the blog and on Facebook, and people passed it around, and I was really hoping we'd get a lawsuit out of it. Didn't work. They didn't bite. So we got to sell real food. If we want to compete with this industrial model, we got to sell real food, and people have to know you. They have to know that you're a family farmer. This is our cattle that out on the pastures where they're raised until they're about 6 months of age, and then they go into the feedlot where they're fed a healthy diet of grain, not GMO corn, but grain like wheat and barley and some hay and the various things that make that diet a balanced diet and a healthy diet. And this gives us, and out here it rains 17 inches a year. And of course this pasture is when it rained. This year we didn't have this much grass. But these are what the cattle look like on pasture. And I love what Vandana Shiva says. Their grazing helps our dehydrating planet retain moisture in the earth, contributing to the global water supplies. And Vandana Shiva is another hero of mine, like Michael Paul and Eric Schlosser. She won Monsanto's Bullshit Award. And I am working so hard right now. I'm working, and help me, please. I would love to be the recipient of that. And I got to tell you, manure from these cattle is really, really important, as Vandana Shiva said. And this is what happens when we haul our manure into Colorado Springs. That's how desperate they are for good manure. And it goes on gardens, and we do fundraisers with manure, and we had a manure fest just a couple weeks ago. Well, this is the manure from 2 years with Jacek Popiel. This is Jacek. He's got a place on the west side that was just an old, hard, rocky, awful piece of dirt in his backyard, and this is what it's grown now. Vandana Shiva told Hillary Clinton that day when she was in India, our cow dung is worth more than your Wall Street stocks. I don't know, is it? What do you think? You can eat that stuff. Wall Street stocks, probably not. I think she's right. So let's create this new food system. Let's have some fun. This is what gives energy. This is cool stuff. Let's go right out to Venatucci Farm, where we're at this week with this mobile slaughter unit. So we're killing the animal where they're at. They don't have the stress of hauling long distances to a packing plant. The slaughter waste stays behind, and we compost that into fertilizer. The meat is more tender because the animals aren't stressed. It employs 5 more people in our community, and we're now processing all of our cattle now at the ranch where they're produced. And you can kind of see how this goes. The animal comes in this end, and it comes out this door into this little truck that hauls it to the plant. This is the inside where the animals are skinned and eviscerated and split. They go into this cooling cooler, and then this is the carcasses at the plant in St. Francis or in Colorado Springs. And when we have a lot of them, this is the trailer that hauls those carcasses into Ranch Foods Direct. And our tag is good food that's good for you. Picture of the carcasses hanging. And this is nothing but the absolute best quality beef that you can buy. Just a picture of what we've got going on there. Our small truck's backed up there, probably just unloaded some carcasses. This is the truck. We have 2 of those that deliver to our restaurants. We have over 100 restaurants in the area, and we sell to 8 school districts. Very important component to our business. This is just a part of our cutting room, and we put on a retail store. Our retail store sales were up 26% year to year, last year to the end of the year, this year, and last week they were up 27%. Again, on top of that, people are really catching on. They want to know where their food comes from. But boy, are there some folks not happy about family farmers selling you food. The U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance is a combination of Monsanto, Farm Bureau, the biggest corporations on the planet, and they're using my checkoff dollars to fund a campaign putting my face and our family farm face on their industrial agriculture. Colorado proud, Cargill Safeway, go locavore in Colorado. If that isn't an affront, if that isn't in your face, one really big, fat lie, and the state of Colorado is allowing them to do it. Farm Check announced just this last week, Tyson is now wanting to look good in front of the Humane Society and in front of people who care about animals, which we do, you do. We want these animals treated humanely. So Tyson's going to try to look good by going out and harassing the serfs that are producing for them now. These are people who work 2 jobs in town so that they can pay the mortgage and grow chickens for Tyson and breathe the dirt and the dust and the arsenic and whatever's it's an unbelievably bad life. This is where I want to get to. You all know about the Ferry Market. You know about the Pike Place Market. One of my favorite markets is the Milwaukee Market. But it's a new place that we can create in Colorado Springs, right down there in Zombieville, where all the worst buildings that have been out of commission for 11 years, where when the manufacturers left, they left these empty buildings behind. Let's go down there and build a public market, a year-round public market with a coffee roaster in it, with a wine shop, with a cheese-making facility, a commissary kitchen, a meat market, a fish market. You can feel it. I mean, this is a place you want to be. It's got a bakery in it. It's got beer. And let's give farmers a place. And let's make it a safe place. Let's create a new community space for eaters, for growers, family farmers, ranchers, local businesses, and separate and safe from big food and Wall Street. And Bob, this is the policy we need. We need policy that promotes this, that makes it easy for farmers and ranchers to connect to eaters, and harder for big food to continue to put us out of business. Thank you.
Get mine up. Great job. Thank you.
Where's your?
I don't. Oh, here's the guy. There we go. I'd like to thank Michael Pollan for inviting me to come out here. It was great flying all the way across the country to be with you all today. And it's a special honor because, you know, if you look at the reporting on food issues, there over the years, for the last 106 years, have been several kind of watershed things written about the food industry, in particular the meat industry. Michael mentioned one, The Jungle, in 1906. He wrote one, The Omnivore's Dilemma. He's written several, but a watershed volume was The Omnivore's Dilemma, as was a book that Mike mentioned, Fast Food Nation by Eric Schlosser, Food Politics by Marion Nessel, and Tomatoland by Barry Easterbrook. So it's really an honor to be out here with you all today. Part of my resume that I don't talk a lot about is I started life on a farm in Kansas as well. My family was a small grains farm. Where Mike lives, we called them ranches. Where I grew up, we called them farms. A small grains farm in eastern Kansas. So I know where St. Francis is. That there's a couple of Miss Kansans were from that part of the state. I grew up in a town called Emporia. And it's a small town about 50 miles south of the capital. But I also claim dual citizenship, I tell people, because my family moved to South Dakota when I was in junior high school, and hence I've got this weird pedigree of having worked for South Dakota politicians as well as some Kansas politicians. I also think it's fitting that I paraphrase one of my favorite presidents tonight, since there's a presidential debate going on, and since we're in the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and that's Abraham Lincoln. In the first year of his presidency, he was asked by a friend in Springfield how he liked being president, and he said it reminded him of this story about the man who was tarred and feathered and ridden out of town on a rail, that if it weren't for the honor of the thing, I'd rather walk. So I hope that I don't give you all a reason to tar and feather me tonight, as I look specifically at the Pew Commission on Industrial Farm Animal Production and the 4 areas we reviewed and the impacts that animal agriculture has in those areas. As Michael said, we had 16 commissioners from various backgrounds, including animal agriculture, human medicine, animal health, ethics. We had actually a couple of people from the meat industry on the commission who, as the recommendations were finalized, and they said they wanted to block all of our recommendations, were resigned from the commission, but we had the benefit of their input. And as Michael said, the Commission found generally that the prevalent farm animal system represents an unacceptable threat to public health, damage to the environment, rural communities, and is harmful to the animals housed in the system. And that is still current enough that the Indianapolis Star, in an editorial today, said that as they fight over the regulation of concentrated animal feeding operations in Indiana, they cited that general recommendation from the Pew Commission. Just so you know, here are some of the people that were on the commission. Some, I've bolded some you may have heard of. Former Kansas Governor John Carlin was on the commission. He was the Archivist of the United States during the Clinton administration. Fred Kirschenman up in this corner was the director of the Aldo Leopold Center at Iowa State at the time. He's now the president of Stone Barns. Here's Mike's pen pal, Dan Glickman, who after Mike found out that I had worked for Dan at one time, he still talked to me, which I appreciate. Brother Dave Andrews here was the director of National Catholic Rural Life Conference at the time the commission started. Here's Marion Nessel was on the commission. Fidel Bascio of Bon Appetit Management Company, whose headquarters is just south of here. And then the founder of Nyman Ranches, Bill Nyman. We defined concentrated animal feeding operations based on the definition by the Environmental Protection Agency. They are really the sole permitting agency involved in industrial farm animal operation, and that's through their governance of the Clean Water Act. It's based, whoops, sorry about that. The EPA is the primary agency that permits KFOs. Some state departments permit them. There is some movement that state departments of agriculture will permit them, but the EPA regulations set the floor. No state can go below the floor they set. These are some pictures of representative of KFOs. You can see up here that's a swine KFO. This is a battery cage operation that's actually, you can't get the real feel for that because that was one we visited in Colorado. The cages are stacked 4 stories tall. This is a typical broiler barn. And this is very similar to the feedlot that Mike was talking about in Greeley, Colorado, but this is actually in the Central Valley here. Common factors in KFOs, and I just want to give you the context that we worked in. Large numbers of the same species of animals confined in a relatively small space, liquid waste management for dairy and swine operations, solid waste management for broiler and egg production, and feedlots, beef feedlots, and in most cases, a lack of natural movement. This is taken from one of our technical reports, and it's a way to look at what goes on in KFOs from a perspective that you may be able to understand. KFOs are comparable to poorly run hospitals where everyone gets antibiotics, patients lie in unchanged beds, hygiene is non-existent, infections and reinfections are rife, waste is thrown out the window, and visitors enter and leave at their own will. This was our process. Just so you know, we took this very seriously. We had 11 meetings around the country, including 2 full public hearings where over 500 members of the public came and testified. We sought to run the Pew Commission as kind of a mix of a congressional hearing and a National Academy of Science process. Hundreds of hours of deliberations, 8 technical reports that were peer-reviewed on the National Academy of Science process basis that we self-published because we couldn't get anybody else to publish them. And we reviewed thousands of pages of information, including at least 170 peer-reviewed reports. Our recommendations were adopted by consensus, and we had 24 primary recommendations. And the 4 areas we were looking at, as we mentioned, are public health, the environment, animal welfare, and rural communities. And the most serious problems we found were in the areas of public health, obviously, the intersection between people and animals. 5 of the recommendations focus specifically on antibiotic use or misuse in food animal production. Before I go into the specifics about the public health impacts and particularly antibiotic use, I just wanted to highlight our main recommendations to solve some of the 24 problems. We said that we should require more permitting of operations. Like I said, EPA permits is the primary permitting entity with some states. But we produce about 550 million tons of waste a year in these KFOs, and only about 45% of them are permitted. So there's a large amount of waste that's being generated and disposed of that no one is regulating. In fact, the EPA recently decided they should try to find out where all the KFOs are in the country. We don't even know where they are. There's at least 20,000 we know about, and they were so challenged by the industrial animal ag sector that they dropped their effort to locate all the KFOs in the country. I tend to think that in an even number year every 4 years, presidential leadership sometimes is not as strong as it should be. Iowa is a swing state, Ohio is a swing state, big KFO states, and so I think there was probably a political reason. I think our most profound recommendation is the simplest one and the one Mike spoke about very passionately: aggressively enforce all existing antitrust laws. There are enough laws on the books through the Packers and Stockyards Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act, and other antitrust legislation that if they were aggressively enforced now, it would go a long ways to leveling the playing field and address a lot of the problems Mike mentioned. That's another area where the administration held a series of 6 joint hearings around the country, Department of Justice and USDA, to talk about contracting problems and threats to family agriculture. Mike's sector of agriculture is probably the last bastion of family independent agriculture. Broiler production of chickens, the chickens we eat, is about 99% contract production, so there's no open market. They're making the same moves in the hog industry. It's about 70% contract production now. And so the last area where there are independent producers really is the cattle industry, and that's disappearing rapidly. There's an upside and a downside to following a producer like Mike, because I'm enthralled by what he's saying, and so I'm not thinking about my own presentation. But he pointed out a really interesting anecdotal statistic in my mind. When he was starting in the business, there were 20 people vying for his livestock, 20 people that would bid for his livestock. Now there might be 1 representing 3 companies. So after having a series of meetings around the country, I attended a couple of them, one near Mike in Fort Collins, Colorado, one in Iowa. They promised aggressive action to address the antitrust problems in the industry. A lot of producers went and talked openly about their problems, knowing that there would be retribution for being so open, and basically nothing happened. Animal welfare, this was our main animal welfare recommendation: ban gestation crates and swine production, battery cages and egg production, and the most restrictive veal crates. Since you live in California, you know about that because of Prop 2. The Humane Society campaigned aggressively on this and won overwhelmingly. Even agricultural counties in California voted in favor of this. And our number 1 public health recommendation that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in depth because it is such a serious problem is we recommended phasing out and banning the non-therapeutic use of antimicrobials in food animal production. Now, antibiotics are antimicrobials, but not all antimicrobials are antibiotics. Other examples of antimicrobials are zinc, copper, arsenic, and they're used in low doses to control the spread of bacteria in these overcrowded KFOs. We also suggested banning new approvals of the non-therapeutic use of antimicrobials and retroactively investigate those that are previously approved for usage. And the devil's always in the details with policy and regulation. And so our number 2, or 1.A recommendation in public health was define use this way. Therapeutic use is only when the animal's sick. Everything else is considered non-therapeutic. And so non-therapeutic would include what's commonly done in most large animal feeding operations, fed in the absence of microbial disease, any use of the drug as an additive for growth, feed efficiency, weight gain, routine disease prevention in the absence of documented exposure or other routine purposes. And we did, recognizing the nature of the animal production system, we did have a definition for prevention or prophylactic treatment, because there are certain times, even the best cattle producers or family swine producers, when they ship animals to slaughter, they can anticipate they're going to get sick in transit, so it just makes good sense to give them antibiotics when they're being shipped. But the key is you give it in a dose that will kill bacteria, not just suppress the bacteria. So we said a preventive use, and this will be important for comparison later on, the use of antimicrobials in health animals in advance of an expected exposure, like shipping, in case they get shipping fever, to an infectious agent, or after such an exposure, but before the onset of laboratory confirmed clinical disease as determined by a licensed professional. So an important difference here is the licensed professional, that we want the veterinarian involved in the prescription of antimicrobials. So why is this important? Well, before 2008, when the Animal Drug User Fee Act was being reauthorized, we had no idea really how many antibiotics were being used in food animal production. Scientists for the Union of Concerned Scientists estimated that it was 70%. The industry always scoffed at that and said, oh no, antibiotics are too expensive. Less than 30% of the antibiotics sold in the country are used in food animal production. With the reauthorization of ADUFA, we required, or the Congress required, that use of antibiotics at the time of sale be reported. And this is based on FDA statistics. The scientist at UCS was wrong. It's 80% of the antibiotics sold in the country are used in industrial food animal production, and of that, about 80% of that 80% are given in low doses on a daily basis to counteract the overcrowding and filthy conditions. At a hearing on Capitol Hill, Deputy Commissioner Josh Sharfstein said that, and this was actually, believe it or not, fairly dramatic at the time he said it, because FDA regulates feed additives. They determine what goes in to feed that's fed to all animals. FDA concludes that the overall weight of evidence to date supports the conclusion that using medically important antimicrobial drugs for production purposes is not in the interest of protecting and promoting public health. I mean, that's when you think about it, it's amazing that it took until 2010 to get someone at that level to admit that the use in food animals is threatening our health, whether you eat meat or not. And I've got a graphic here in a little bit that kind of highlights that. So at the Center for a Livable Future, we call the lower dosage antimicrobial misuse. And these are the characteristics of misuse: lower dose, longer duration, administered in the feed and water, and limited veterinary oversight. And this is the delivery mechanism based on 2009 statistics of that same reporting mechanism that we got the 80%. 74% administered in feed, 16% water, 10% other. Therapeutic doses are almost never administered in feed and water unless it's a flock of chickens, because to concentrate the dosage, it's done as an injectable. So you can see how little is really administered appropriately. The reason why I said it was interesting that it took so long for the FDA to admit the link to public health. This is Sir Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin in 1924, natural penicillin. It was synthesized later. And he said in his Nobel acceptance speech that the time may come when penicillin can be bought by anyone in the shops or over the internet, like a lot of industrial food animal operations do. Then there's the danger that the ignorant man may easily underdose himself, and by exposing his microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug, make them resistant. If you use penicillin, use enough of it. And what he's done here is really outline the protocol for use of antibiotics in industrial food animal production. They give it in low doses over a long period of time to suppress bacteria instead of kill the bacteria. Those that aren't killed, those that are suppressed, come out resistant to those antibiotics they've been exposed to, plus every class of antibiotic that antibiotic comes from. So we're developing what's called pan-resistant bacteria. It's interesting with the split in the government about the use of antibiotics. This top quote is from an economic research service study from 2009 that says a heavy reliance on antibiotics for growth promotion and for disease prevention may spawn antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria with human health risks. They said that the biggest abusers were large hog operations, and that the reason why producers were using it is because they were using it because of poor animal husbandry and because of poor sanitary protocols. Too many animals, too small a space, poor handling of their waste. At the same hearing that Josh Sharfstein spoke at, that I had the quote earlier, this guy is John Clifford, a vet from USDA. He says, well, maybe there's a link, we're not sure. Tom Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, in a letter to Representative Louise Slaughter of New York, about 3 months later said, there's no problem. It wouldn't make sense for us to abuse antibiotics. The USDA position is and always has been that, and I don't know if you can see the bolding, that antibiotics need to be used judiciously, and we believe they are. So everything's fine. So you've got the group worried about protecting public health, the FDA, and regulating what's going into the KFOs in their feed, saying, no, there's a link. And some people at USDA saying, yeah, there's a link, but people that have the power saying, we're not so sure. This is a graphic that I wanted, it's not very scientific or not really very good, but the questions that Michael asked, are you a vegetarian, vegan, or omnivore? When you look at food animal production and the use of antibiotics, it doesn't matter if you don't eat meat. And here's why, because here's the KFO, here's a worker coming out of the KFO, covered in antibiotic-resistant bacteria, going into his community hospital. Here's the worker transporting the live hogs to the food processing facility with antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Oh, and here's a real interesting one too. Birds carry the resistant bacteria. Oh, and it's also manure containing antibiotic-resistant bacteria is spread on surrounding fields. I think the last 4 or 5 cases of resistant E. coli and Salmonella and Campylobacter were actually on fruits and vegetables that where KFO waste was applied as a fertilizer. There's been some scientific studies, some done by Johns Hopkins where I work, that show that antibiotic-resistant bacteria that spread on lettuce fields is actually taken up in the plant, and so you're exposed to it that way. And about 3 weeks ago, I think I pay a lot of attention to food recalls. I wasn't paying enough attention, and I actually got a exposure to E. coli. Luckily, it wasn't resistant. The reason why it doesn't matter if you eat meat or not and why you're at risk is because antibiotics are what's called a community drug. And that means if I misuse them, that affects everybody in the room because the bacteria that's in my body can be spread. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria in Johns Hopkins studies have been shown to come off rather freely off of chicken trucks, broiler trucks transporting animals to slaughter. We have a lot of chicken density in the eastern shore of Maryland, and we've done studies with a closed car that follows a chicken truck at a safe distance, and the car is swabbed, and it's loaded with resistant Campylobacter and Salmonella from the truck. There have been tests that Johns Hopkins has participated in that has shown bacteria has shown up on flies at least 5 miles from concentrated animal feeding operations. So it really should be a concern to everybody, just because they're a community drug and the misuse anywhere is a danger. Here is kind of a real world reason why it matters. Antibiotic resistance undermines treatment options. There are about 94,000 invasive methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus cases a year, 18,000 deaths related to those a year. Hospital stays are longer and more costly, and that cost is, on the conservative side, $17 billion. I've seen a cost as high as $33 billion to the US economy. And a researcher, a guy from Johns Hopkins who now is at a place in northern Arizona called Translational Genomics, has actually done the DNA fingerprinting of MRSA, and we now know that the current strain of MRSA, whether you get it in a farm or in a hospital or on your food, started as an antibiotic susceptible staph that was carried into hog operations by the workers, and because of the routine low-level use of antibiotics, it was translated into this methicillin-resistant staph, the superbug, and brought back out into the community. Here are some quick things trying to be done to stop overuse of antibiotics. There's a bill called PAMTA. It's been introduced to every Congress since 2003. In the 111th Congress, which was last year, it had 127 co-sponsors in the House, 18 co-sponsors in the Senate. This Congress, it's dropped to 92 and 7. This legislation would ban the 7 most prevalent antibiotics used in human medicine from animal use. But again, that's antibiotics. That's not all antimicrobials. The FDA has not been really a profile and courage on this. They started banning antibiotics, penicillin and tetracycline in 1977. They issued notices saying they should be withdrawn. The animal ag industry got to Congress, and Congress told FDA, you're not going to do that. So the FDA stopped their legal proceedings to withdraw these antibiotics, but they never closed out the notices. So they've now tried to stop those notices. Well, citizens petitions were filed in 1999 and 2000 to say, we want you to go ahead with this. They did ban fluoroquinolones, which is related to cephalosporin, or ciprofloxacin. So Cipro, the only thing that really will fight anthrax, had a derivative in animal production that was lessening the ability of Cipro to work. So you had that moving ahead, but FDA decided they would listen to industrial ag and not do anything. And they decided instead to go through these voluntary guidances to redefine the use of antibiotics in food animal production. And this is where the definition that I mentioned earlier will be important. In the new guidance 209, here is what they say about prevention. In a situation where disease is likely to occur if the drug is not administered. Well, that's every KFO in the country. Because if you don't spread the animals out, if you don't treat them humanely, then they're going to be susceptible to the bacteria. And this is by comparison the definition from the Pew Commission. One of the things that happened was FDA decided to withdraw these unfinished regulatory actions. The National Resource Defense Council said, no, you don't. You're gonna abide by the law. And they sued FDA. The judge at the initial level said, NRDC's right. FDA, go ahead with the withdrawal process to remove penicillin and tetracycline. And you must consider what citizens say about this. And FDA, true to form, is appealing whether or not they have to abide by the law. I just wanted to point out the United States is kind of an outlier on antibiotic use in food animal production. This shows all the major swine-producing countries in the world. This is put together by a guy I know at the National Food Institute at the University of Denmark. And you can see where we are. We're right up there with that progressive country of Greece as far as the amount of antibiotics used, with a low of Norway. And here is Denmark, which banned the non-therapeutic use of antibiotics in 1996. And here's been the, the industry says, oh my God, the world will starve. Every animal on the planet will die if we don't do it the way we've been doing it. Well, this shows where the non-therapeutic use stopped. This shows a little bit of a dip in production in the first year after antibiotic use was stopped in Denmark. But you see regular increase in production and number of piglets per sow. So what they did right here to make this jump up again, they did 4 production changes. They spread the animals out, they cleaned the pens better, they weaned the pigs later so the piglets would get immunity from the sows, and they ventilated the barns better. In a sense, they went back to animal husbandry instead of animal science. So I really appreciate the time today. Again, it's such an honor to be here with all of you. This is my contact information if you want to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. I would like to leave you with one quote from a guy who I've read quite a bit of from the 1930s and 40s. His name is Sir Albert Howard. And he said that, and it still, I think, has currency today, the subject of soil, plant, animal, and human health is all one topic. So, thank you.
Okay, sit up here.
Yep.
Mike, am I on? Yeah. Why don't you sit here? We have to do a little homework first, because there's a couple terms you guys didn't define. Because you're in so deep. But I want you to tell us just briefly, either of you, what does the Packer and Stockyards Act provide for? What are the laws on the books that are not being enforced?
Well, back in 1921, when that act was really implemented, it provided that the packers could not discriminate.
And by packers, you're talking about the companies that slaughter meat and then sell it to us, right?
That's correct. They buy from the producer. And the Packers and Stockyards Act was really developed to protect the producer. Prior to that, the antitrust laws were really designed for the consumer's protection. So this was a unique law, and it basically said that they can't discriminate, they can't show preference, they basically cannot treat a producer unfairly. And these are all broad terms by design. You don't want to be too narrow in your definition in law because you want to give it room to be developed and for precedent to be set. And the problem with the Packers and Stockyards Act is it never got litigated. It never got enforced. All that happened to it was it got weakened, particularly in the Reagan years. When President Reagan came into office, he became sort of that dereg president, which Monsanto loved. And in fact, you may have seen some of the videos of Vice President George Bush going through the Monsanto factory and assuring them that they would get what they wanted from that administration. And so the Packers and Stockyards Act never got really litigated and in fact got gutted along the way during that 90 or so years until my case came along, and I was really the first case that was filed based on the Packers and Stockyards Act, and it was our intention to get it enforced. And we won that lawsuit. The jury awarded us $1.28 billion. We honestly did not care about the money.
This was a class action on the part of
That's correct. So John Tyson did have something to worry about. And so we won $1.28 billion, and we were happy about that, not celebrating. What we would have celebrated was the injunctive relief. where they got to write rules that said, okay, Mr. Packer, you cannot show preference to this guy over here while you're discriminating against this guy. You can't use captive supplies to stay out of the marketplace because they reduce competition in the market. It's all about maintaining competition in the market. Well, what happened was,
Yeah, why don't you have a better plan?
the judge reversed our jury verdict, took the $1.28 billion away from us, class action, the class, and made us pay $80,000 of Tyson's court costs. Now that ought to be a lesson. That's a spanking by the judge. And so we didn't give up. We appealed it, lost on the appeal. Of course, a Reagan appointee judge. Now, Judge Lyle Strom was a Reagan appointee. He was a dereg judge with that dereg mentality. Don't need rules. And so other judges on that appeals court agreed with him, and we ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court with that case, at which point the Supreme Court had two cases before them. The Cattlemen's case for fair markets based on the Packers and Stockyards Act hadn't been enforced, really needed some guidance here. The other case that they would decide whether to hear is the Anna Nicole Smith Family Feud case. We got to hear the Anna Nicole Smith Family Feud case. And the cattlemen got thrown in the Tyson meat grinder that day, and where we remain today. And it gave them the green light to just go ahead and just let her rip. Get as big as you want.
And what year was that?
Anything you want. That in 2004 is when we won the court case. It was probably by, I can't recall the date, but probably around 2006 or so by the time we finally got that Supreme Court decision that they would not hear our case.
Yeah, this is really important history. And on this issue of monopoly, Mike didn't talk about it, but if you read some of the material from Cornered, there was a kind of, you know, the whole idea of antitrust law is to protect the public from concentrated power. And we have the Sherman Antitrust Act and other antitrust laws. But a change happened in the Reagan administration in 1981 where the standard on the part of the government for deciding to bring one of these suits was not the concentration of power, but how it hurt or didn't hurt the consumer. So if you couldn't prove you were damaged by companies getting together and acting as monopolies, you could no longer sue. And one of the problems in the meat industry is that concentration has actually helped the consumer in certain ways, in certain narrow definition. Is that not right?
I don't think so. I don't think so. It is, I think, hurt the consumer because of today, the consumer is paying around $5.05 per pound at a Walmart, King Soopers, and Safeway.
For beef.
For beef. The producer is receiving about 53% of that based on that graph I showed you. The producer is still short 12% of what a competitive market would have given them. So that's about $300 a head that the producer is short in his share of what he should be receiving. If the packer was passing that savings on to the consumer, that beef should be $300 a head cheaper at the retail market. They are exerting the same power that Upton Sinclair talked about in the jungle and that John B. Kendrick talked about as senator from Wyoming when they passed the Packers and Stockyards Act, that the packer is standing between the producer on one hand and the consumer on the other and taking advantage of both.
Both sides.
And worse, we have given the consumer the worst meat that there has ever been in human history going on your plates right now. You don't even know what's in it. I really want to talk about Zelmax. Why can't we talk about Zelmax? We talked about pink slime.
All right, we're going to talk about Zelmax in a minute, but Bob's got something to say.
Yeah, and added to that problem, the large companies can externalize their costs. So what you're paying at the supermarket is actually an artificially low cost of the product. Because like the slide I showed that there's a maybe as much as a $33 billion cost in the routine use of antibiotics in food animal production that you pay as a taxpayer. There are costs in environmental damage that you pay as a taxpayer. There are other healthcare costs linked to the food system, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer. So not only do they get nailed on the end that Mike's talking about, but the reason why it appears that it's a good deal for the consumer is they're not paying the true cost of what they're consuming.
Just another quick point on the Packers and Stockyards Act, and one of the precedents that really did get set as a result of the Supreme Court not hearing our case was they got away with trying to make us prove harm to competition. And so if a poultry grower was cheated on his weights by a processor, he may win that argument that they in fact did cheat him on his weights, but he could not collect damages because the fact that he was cheated on his chickens didn't hurt anybody else that produced chickens. It's like you losing your purse. Someone steals your purse and you go after the guy and he spent all your money and stole your ID and ran up all your credit cards, and there's been major damage done as a result of your purse being stolen. You cannot do a darn thing to that guy until you prove that everyone else in this room was damaged as well through the loss of your purse. That's how ridiculous this law is now, after the lack of good judicial decisions on this act.
That's why the proposed rule that was being talked about that Mike and I both touched on actually had a very important component, and that is a producer. An antitrust action could be brought based on individual harm to the producer, not the class of producers, not the consuming public, but by the harm to an individual producer.
These are the rules that were being considered at the beginning of this administration that have gone nowhere.
And they've been defeated. They have been defeated by Congress. The Ag Committee just killed Dudley Butler at that hearing. And my Senator Pat Roberts from Kansas lied flat out about what those rules were going to do, and he lied flat out about Dudley Butler, which is a pretty disturbing thing for a U.S. Senator to do in front of the public.
The question a lot of the students had, and we'll turn to your questions in a minute, but from your reading responses, several of you asked the same thing, which is, and this is for both of you, what would you say the best way that a consumer can support small entrepreneurs, food producers, in the fight against monopolization?
Well, you know, we talk about what you support prospers, what you feed grows. You got to buy from the farmer. One of the things that's really bugging me right now, besides Zilmax,
we'll get to that.
is all these certification programs.
Right.
These third-party certification programs. So many of them are just a fraud. And what they're trying to do is...
Give us an example of a third-party certification.
Well, like IMI Global from Castle Rock, Colorado. They come out and they charge you $3,000 to certify your operation, your
as
livestock.
What? As humane? As what?
Well, as that you know where your animals come from, that maybe perhaps they're antibiotic or hormone free, that what is the protocol that you want as a reseller of beef or meat or pork or chicken. They want to make sure that those attributes are being done at a particular location.
And this is to support the labels we find in our markets.
Exactly. And so IMI Global, they go out there, they collect money from the producer who doesn't have any, because he doesn't have a competitive market and all of his neighbors and friends have already gone out of business. So now we're going to charge him more. And really, who's IMI Global working for? Are they working for the guy paying them, or for the retailer that wants the certification? Or perhaps it's an exporter. Maybe it's a product to go to Europe. They can't have hormones, and we got to know where they came from. So it's an origin claim, and it's a no hormone claim. And so Europe is hiring this IMI Global, one of many, to go out there and just find them sources of cattle that they know where they came from, and they know they weren't implanted or steroids and so forth were used on those. Well, the problem is it's adding a lot of costs to the producer, and it's not solving his problem of not receiving a fair income for his livestock, and it's really enabling industrial buyers to go out there and know where all these animals are and really, in a way, control the market as a result. This Tyson thing worries me that we saw that check thing that they're doing, because now they're going to have even a better idea of where the animals are, and they can control inventories better. So it really
this
hurts
idea
the
of
competitive
corporate
marketplace.
Transparency, corporate labels that help you with antibiotic-free or whatever, you don't think are
I
adequate.
think
You really
they're-
think it's direct
I think they're useless.
sales.
I want to go back to creating local, regional food systems food hubs, where, like the thing I showed you in Colorado Springs, not only this beautiful retail space where people can come, but a separate building where farmers can bring truckloads of stuff in, and where restaurants can go buy cases of stuff, and really just get all about local, keeping that wealth in the community and keeping good food. And then you go meet your farmer. I mean, get to know him, or maybe you depend on your friend that took the trip last week. But you know, every year we have, in the spring, we have a trip that we put together to St. Francis for people, whoever wants to go. And we put vans or buses together and we bring them out, and they meet our public, they meet people in our community, and it's really cool. We eat hamburgers, and then we go look at stuff, and it's neat.
Bob, what's your answer to that question?
Well, I would agree with Mike about a lot of that. There's an effort going on right now called Fix Food. I don't know if you've been aware of it, but it's urging consumers to go into wherever they buy meat, whether it's Trader Joe's or Safeway or wherever, and demand that they provide enough meat, raised antibiotic free at a cost equal to conventional meat. I think that there's a petition that's been circulated online that's, I think, got 250,000 signatures urging Trader Joe's, which is, you know, tries to market itself as a food company that's interested in consumers and doing things the right way, urging them to buy meat that's raised sustainably without antibiotics. So I think you do what Mike says. Well, I guess my general recommendation is ask questions and demand answers.
Great, thank you. All right, Zelmax, 1 minute.
Zelmax is a beta agonist. It's an aggressive muscle enhancer in cattle that's being used. It's inhumane.
It's a pharmaceutical?
It is. It's inhumane. It causes joint failure in these animals. You use it the last 30 or 40 days of the feeding period, it'll put an extra 25 pounds on a carcass. But these animals just explode their muscles. And if you don't get those animals loaded on that truck when they're supposed to go, perhaps some bad weather comes in, a blizzard, something happens, then they're crippled and can't get on the truck. It's that much damage to their joints. And we are feeding this to these animals and allowing this in our food system. It's inhumane. It also causes heat stress. We lost thousands of cattle a couple summers ago when the heat hit Kansas, south central Kansas, and particularly bad on black cattle. But this Zelmax makes these animals much more excitable. It makes them crazy, and then they die when it gets hot outside. Plus the joint failure, plus the fact that we are feeding this stuff to our kids. And I got to tell you, Temple Grandin thinks this is bad stuff. And why can't we get it banned? It's related to ractopamine, the same stuff that's totally banned in Europe and Japan and all these countries. Why can't we? We need to think of a name for Zelmax like pink slime.
Like pink slime. That's the job, right? You guys know about pink slime? Okay.
Thanks to Food Inc.
That's right. Thanks to Food Inc. and the blogger in Houston who got that petition
right.
going. So there's a great story for someone. Zelmax. Have you read anything about it? This is a terrific story. Somebody should take this on as their final project. How do you spell it?
Z-I-L-M-A-X. Z-I-L-M-A-X.
And if you're interested in or concerned about animal welfare, think about what that animal's going through.
Oh.
I mean, and I would guarantee there's not been enough scientific testing to know what the proper withdrawal time is. So is there a residue in what you're consuming? What's that doing to your physiology? I mean, it's horrendous.
One of the things about the Zelmax, if you go to my blog and just keyword what happened to the meat, it'll get you a lot of information on Zelmax, ractopamine, and other stuff.
Great. Questions from you guys? Yes? We can't hear you. Stand up. The ramifications of the Tyson statement.
The one you saw? Well, the ramification is that Walmart is in control. the big retailer is now in control. It used to be the packer was in control, like John B. Kendrick said, consumers on one hand, producers on the other. Now it's the retailer. The retailer's bigger and more powerful than the packers. And that only has come in the last several years that Walmart went by Kroger as the biggest food retailer in America. So now the big retailers, and Cisco is no lightweight either. And so these companies now have power over the packer, which then it's all course of least resistance. So the order comes from Walmart, we're going to buy cheaper. The packer says we're going to buy cheaper, but these folks maintain their margins and they just shove it right downhill onto the farm and ranch, which invests 85% of the capital it takes to put a hamburger on your bun or a steak on the plate. Those guys that are pushing you around in the marketplace only have 15% of that capital invested that it takes to finish it on up to where it's on the plate. So the person taking the most risk, investing the most capital, has the least amount of power and is getting cheated in this marketplace.
Yeah, I think I saw a statistic that Walmart now sells more groceries than the next 4 combined. It's like 42% of the grocery market.
Another question. Yes?
Boy, I can't hear that.
A little louder. What are the barriers to entry in the ranching industry? Why aren't we seeing more direct-to-consumer selling?
Because of the predators in the marketplace. And because of a lack of processing. In fact, it was Food and Water Watch that did the really great paper on what happened to the meat processors. And USDA is complicit in this as well. USDA has made it very difficult for the small processor to do business. They have enabled the big processor through the HACCP program. The big guys can afford someone.
Food safety program passed under Clinton.
Yes, hazard analysis critical control point thing that the USDA implemented, which basically took inspectors out of the big meat packing plants, replaced it with paperwork. It's also known as have a cup of coffee and pray. And you've seen the food safety issues that have come out of these big plants. And the one in Canada right now, they're saying slow the chain down. Of course, these are inexperienced workers. There's just not enough inspection. It's just this whole no rules environment. But in my business, I've had 3 food safety assessments, I think in the last 4 years, and some plants have never had one. What is going on here? Why are they after me? I can't imagine why they'd be after me. But they make it very hard for the small plant to survive. And so what they do, these small locker plants give up their USDA inspection and go state inspected. Then they can't ship across state lines. They can't sell wholesale. And they've just put up the barriers. And then you've got Cisco rolling around the country paying kickbacks to restaurants, which is clearly illegal under the FTC and Justice Department rules. And they are predatory pricing, also clearly illegal. They do it anyway. This is a no-rules game.
I think access to capital is another problem. I mean, if you look at a more sustainable ag system emerging, it is access to processing. I think access to capital, access to land. I think our diet has a lot to say about, our federal trade rules all play a part in inhibiting a more sustainable system. But one of the things, I think it's just getting started, is that state-inspected meat is being allowed to be sold interstate, between states more and more now.
But the problem is the states don't have the money to hire the inspectors. And so New Mexico just pulled their state inspection. So that's another barrier is a lack of money, just a lack of taxpayer dollars to fund those programs.
Ranchers also tell me, people trying to do local meat, that their cost of processing is so high for the reasons they're describing that if you're raising cattle, say, it can cost $400 or $500 to get that animal slaughtered, cut into usable cuts. Whereas if you're Tyson or one of the big producers, they can do the same work for about $50 because of their economies of scale and the brutality of their system and their labor costs.
The big packers hire economic and war refugees. According to the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, On the typical big meatpacking plant, you have to speak 110 languages today to communicate. 18% of those workers are Muslim workers. What does that tell you? The Middle East is producing workers. It's those refugees from those war zones that is feeding the labor into these big meatpacking plants. This is wrong. This is something we could fix with policy. We are enabling these people to externalize massive costs. And when these workers don't get paid a living wage, which they do not, then they go to the local welfare office or the local hospital with an injury, and they don't pay those bills.
I want to get one question in about antibiotics. You know, I remember coming down to meet you, Bob, right at the beginning of this administration. And I asked what you thought we could make some progress on. And you brought up the subject of antibiotics in livestock. And you told me about a meeting, and I hope this wasn't off the record, with the head of the FDA, Margaret Hamburg. And she said, either to you or to someone you talked to, that we're treating this issue of antibiotics in livestock as if our hair is on fire. High priority. Who put out the fire in her hair?
I think it burned all the hair on her head. That's a very good question. I mean, she did say that. And I was in a group meeting of several activists. I've long considered the Center for Veterinary Medicine at FDA, which controls all these access points to animal feed and antibiotics, to be a captured agency. There's such a revolving door between people at the FDA and especially the CVM and the industrial side of the meat industry. The guy that I quoted up there, that Josh Sharfstein, he was Margaret Hamburg's deputy. The plan, according to rumor, was that, well, they thought there was going to be a second Obama administration, and some of us are still hopeful that he would take her place in a second Obama administration, and he was getting tough. Well, he left about 6 weeks after that hearing. He's now the head of the Department of Health in the state of Maryland. And so it's the industry just grinds these people down. The second person in charge now is someone I know you guys have heard of, Mike Taylor, who is Mr. Revolving Door at Monsanto. And he does just enough, I think, to mollify advocates like the people at Food and Water Watch or Union of Concerned Scientists or the Pew Environment and Pew Health Group or the Center for a Livable Future where I work, that just no significant progress gets made. The other thing is, a lot of it is in the details. Like they say that they're using antibiotics judiciously under current practices. You know, how could you not be for disease prevention? If we withdraw these antibiotics, all the animals are going to drop dead. Well, they probably will unless you start treating them more humanely, treating the waste as a serious byproduct, reintegrating livestock with crop operations. I mean, so they don't think outside the current system box.
Yeah, so there's a lot of work to be done. We've got to wrap up. There's so much more. As you can see, we've just really scratched the surface. I strongly encourage you to spend time with the Pew Commission report, which is an amazing document. It's on BSpace. Mike's website, also the book Cornered that he talked about by Barry Lynn is really worth reading. And of course, fast food. Oh yeah, I got to tell you this. I'm sorry. And of course, Fast Food Nation, which is a very good, will get you up to speed on a lot of these issues. Okay, 5% of you are vegan. 19% of you are vegetarians. And 75% of you are omnivores. We'll do this again at the end of the course. Thanks a lot.
Michael, I might just mention that we have a recovery program for vegetarians.
Mike's got a recovery program for vegetarians, so you can see him after. Thank you.